There's a shot in Goodfellas that burns into your brain and never leaves. 4 seconds, maybe less. Clapton's Layla on the soundtrack, not the guitar. The piano part. The one that sounds like a funeral procession. Camera just sits on a refrigerated meat truck on some anonymous street. Doors swing open, and there he is, Frankie Carbone, hanging between the beef carcasses like he's one of them. Stiff as a mannequin, skin gone blue-gray, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Henry's voice drifts over the top of it, casual, almost bored, talking about how it took 2 days to thaw the body out before they could even cut him open. 4 seconds, no context, no backstory. You don't even get a last name beyond Carbone. Just the image and the voiceover, and then the camera's already rolling to the next corpse. Because after Lufthansa, there was always another corpse. There was a line of them. That shot has haunted everybody who's ever watched this movie. And I mean everybody. Not because it's graphic, Marty showed worse. It's the specific nature of it. A human being frozen solid and stored alongside animal carcasses, like inventory, discovered by whoever happened to crack those doors on the wrong morning. It might be the most unsettling death in the history of crime films. And almost none of it is true. Not the way you think it is. Here's what the movie never explained. Frankie Carbone is based on a real guy named Angelo Sepe. And Angelo Sepe was not frozen in a meat truck. He was not killed by Jimmy Burke. He was not murdered because he spent too much money or bought his wife something flashy. Angelo Sepe caught 3 bullets to the skull in a basement apartment in Brooklyn on a July morning in 1984. And his girlfriend, 17 when they got together, barely into her 20s when she died, was asleep in the next room. They walked in there and shot her too, put the barrel in her mouth while she slept. She never opened her eyes. And the frozen meat truck? That happened. That's a real thing. But it happened to somebody else entirely. A man the movie never identifies? A man whose actual story is darker and stranger and more twisted than anything Marty put on screen. A con artist who got hogtied, left to freeze, and whose body was eventually found by children. That's what I want to break down today. Every layer of this thing. Who Angelo Sepe really was, what he actually did, how he actually died, who the frozen man in the truck really was, and why Marty took 2 completely separate murders, 2 different men, 2 different years, 2 different circumstances, and welded them into one 4-second image that gave the most iconic death in Goodfellas to the wrong person. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. The real versions of these events aren't less disturbing than the movie. They're worse, at every level. More violent, more senseless, more cold-blooded. The film gave Carbone's death a clean reason. He got greedy, he got killed. Reality doesn't work that clean. In reality, the murders after Lufthansa dragged on for years. Not weeks, years. And they reached people who had zero connection to the heist. A teenage girl sleeping in a bed, a woman whose dismembered remains washed onto a New Jersey beach, a con man with Jimmy Burke's home phone number sewn into the lining of his coat. None of that made the cut. None of it could fit inside 4 seconds of piano music. To understand who Frankie Carbone really was, you have to go back to where all of this starts. Robert's Lounge, Lefferts Boulevard, South Ozone Park, Jimmy Burke's headquarters, and inside that operation, one of the most dependable and most dangerous men Burke ever had on his payroll, Angelo John Sepe. Born January 14th, 1941, right there in South Ozone Park. The guy started accumulating arrests at 14 years old. By the time he was a grown man, he had a rap sheet that read, like a criminal curriculum, petty theft at the bottom, working up through burglary, assault, weapons charges. One writer described him as a lowlife whose arrest record was the most consistent in Burke's entire crew, juvenile and adult combined. And that's saying something, because Burke didn't exactly surround himself with Boy Scouts. Sepe was lean, barely cleared 5 feet, dressed like he didn't own a mirror, in a world where guys spent serious money looking sharp, the suits, the shoes, the whole production. Sepe couldn't have cared less. He looked like he'd slept in his clothes, and most days he probably had. But he had one quality that made him indispensable to Jimmy Burke. He'd do anything. Anything. No hesitation, no questions, no visible conscience. You pointed him at a problem, and the problem stopped existing. He crossed paths with Tommy DeSimone in prison, both doing time for hijacking. Tommy brought him to Burke. And Burke, who had an eye for young guys with violent streaks who knew when to deploy them, recognized exactly what Sepe was the moment he met him, brought him into the Roberts Lounge crew, cultivated him, shielded him, and within a few years, Angelo Sepe had become one of Burke's primary instruments for the kind of work that doesn't appear on any payroll. Now here's a detail the movie could never accommodate, because it makes the picture too complicated. Sepe loved animals. His apartment was a menagerie: rabbits, birds, turtles, strays he'd collected off the street. Whatever wandered in, he took care of it. This isn't folklore. This is documented across multiple accounts of his life. A man who could put 3 bullets into another human being before breakfast and then go home and hand feed a stray rabbit in his kitchen. The mob manufactures these contradictions constantly, but Sepe's version was extreme even by those standards. He married Tony Rodriguez's sister. Rodriguez was a Lucchese associate, which knotted him deeper into the crew's family structure. That marriage ended. He took up with a girl named Joanna Lombardo. She was 17, he was pushing 40. She was studying to work with a veterinarian, living in Long Island City. He was a career criminal with a cocaine addiction that was consuming over 2 grams a day by the late 70s. The drug use accelerated after Lufthansa. The cash was flowing, the paranoia was building, and for Sepe, cocaine had crossed the line from recreation to architecture. It was holding his days together. December 11th, 1978, the Lufthansa job, one of the most meticulously assembled armed robberies this country has ever seen. Burke had been building this thing for months at Roberts Lounge, working from inside intelligence supplied by a cargo supervisor named Louis Werner. Werner owed 20 grand in gambling debts to a bookmaker named Martin Krugman. Krugman passed the opportunity to Henry Hill. Hill brought it to Burke, and Burke assembled his team. Around 3 in the morning, the crew moved on the cargo terminal at Kennedy Airport. Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafora, Joe Manry, Paolo Lacastri, Robert McMahon. They knew the facility inside out. Werner had provided floor plans, vault locations, security rotation schedules, and one critical piece of mechanical knowledge. One door in the double vault system had to close fully before the second could open without tripping the alarm. They were inside for roughly an hour. When they walked out, they had $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry. Largest cash robbery in American history at that point. Sepe was one of the armed men controlling the hostages inside the terminal. A cargo worker named Kerry Whalen took a beating during the robbery. When investigators showed Whalen photographs afterward, he identified Sepe as the man who'd worked him over. The FBI later bugged Sepe's Cadillac and picked up a conversation where he referenced a brown case and a bag connected to Lufthansa. It wasn't enough to build a prosecution. It was enough to confirm what every law enforcement agent in Queens already suspected. And then the dying started. First to go was Stax Edwards, 27 years old. His one assignment, drive the getaway van to a scrapyard in Jersey and watch it get crushed. Instead, he parked it on a street in Ozone Park and went inside to get high. Police recovered it within days, fingerprints intact. A week after the heist, DeSimone and Sepe went to Edwards' apartment and put 5 rounds into him. That was Sepe's first confirmed kill in the Lufthansa cleanup. It would not be the last. Over the following months, Burke systematically erased anyone he believed could tie him to the robbery or might break under pressure from investigators. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who delivered the tip in the first place, vanished in January '79. Believed murdered, body dismembered, remains never recovered. Louis Cafora and his wife disappeared. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon turned up shot dead in a vehicle in Brooklyn. At least 9 people with direct or peripheral connections to the heist were murdered in the months following it. Sepe survived all of it. He was one of the only crew members who'd been inside the terminal that night and wasn't subsequently killed by Burke. The reason, by every account, was straightforward. Sepe was still operational. He was one of the men carrying out the cleanup, not one of the men being cleaned up. As long as there were still problems to eliminate, Sepe had value. But value in Burke's world was never permanent. It was a lease, not a deed. And Sepe, burning through money at a pace his criminal income couldn't sustain, his cocaine habit eating him alive, made a decision that no amount of loyalty or history could protect him from. Sometime in the summer of '84, Sepe robbed a drug dealer. Not a civilian, not an outsider. A dealer with Lucchese family connections. Someone whose cash and product belonged, in the arithmetic of that world, to the organization itself. Sepe took thousands in cash and a quantity of cocaine. He kept it. Maybe he figured his years of service, his body count, his history with the crew bought him a pass. It didn't. July 18th, 1984, 2 men carrying silenced pistols entered the basement apartment at 8861 20th Avenue in Bath Beach, Brooklyn. CP was in the front room. Before he could speak, before he could bargain, before he could beg them to leave Joanna out of it, they put 3 rounds into his head. Then they walked into the sleeping alcove where Joanna Lombardo was asleep. One of the gunmen placed the barrel of his silenced weapon into her open mouth and fired once. She never woke up. She was in her early 20s. She had no criminal record. She had no involvement in anything Angelo Sepe had ever done. She died because she was in the room, because in this world, witnesses, even unconscious ones, are a category of problem, and problems get solved. Angelo Sepe was 43 years old, 14 arrests spanning 3 decades, at least 2 documented murders for Jimmy Burke, a participant in the most famous robbery in American history. And he died because he stole from the people he'd spent his life serving. Not from strangers, from his own organization. That's how it ended. Not in a meat truck, not frozen between carcasses. 3 bullets in a basement in Brooklyn, and a girl in the next room who never had a chance. So if Sepe wasn't the man in the truck who was, his name was Richard Eaton. And Richard Eaton is one of the strangest, most overlooked figures in this entire saga. He wasn't a gangster, not in the way you'd recognize one. He was a grifter, a con man, a middleman who occupied the gray space between organized crime and legitimate business, making himself useful to both sides and fully trusted by neither. Eaton had gone to Notre Dame on an athletic scholarship, spoke fluent Spanish and Italian, well-dressed, well-spoken, educated, the kind of guy who could walk into a boardroom or a back room and look like he belonged in either one, and completely devoid of any moral center whatsoever. He ran non-union garment shops in Queens and Brooklyn that had Lucchese family ties. He operated restaurants and clubs in Florida that functioned, among other things, as laundering vehicles for dirty cash. After the Lufthansa job, Burke channeled a portion of the stolen money through Eaton's Florida operations to be washed and returned clean. Eaton did the job. Then, and this is the part where you realize just how badly this man miscalculated his own position, he skimmed. He siphoned money from the laundered funds, money that belonged to Jimmy Burke, money connected to the most high-profile robbery in the country. In the world these men inhabited, skimming from mob money isn't a mistake with consequences. It's a death sentence with a processing delay. The outcome was never in question. The only variable was timing. Burke had Eaton killed. The body turned up hog-tied inside a refrigerated meat truck. It had been in there long enough for rigor mortis to lock every joint in his body solid. Investigators needed more than 2 days before the coroner could even begin the autopsy. And when they went through his clothing, they found a phone book hidden inside the lining of his coat. In that phone book, Jimmy Burke's name Jimmy Burke's home telephone number, an address in Island Park, New York. The FBI used it as evidence. Burke was convicted of Eaton's murder in 1985 and sentenced to life. He died of lung cancer at Roswell Park in Buffalo on April 13, 1996. 64 years old. And the piece of evidence that put him there? A dead con man's coat with a phone number sewn into the lining. That's the frozen meat truck. Not a lifelong enforcer who bled for the crew. A grifter who thought he could skim from the most dangerous man in Queens and walk away clean. Whose body was discovered by children when someone opened the wrong truck doors on the wrong morning. That's who that 4-second shot actually belongs to. What Marty did was take Richard Eaton's death and graft it onto Angelo Sepe's character. 2 men, 2 murders, 2 completely unrelated stories collapsed into one image and a single line of narration. And as pure cinema, it's genius. It compresses the full horror of the Lufthansa aftermath into one shot you'll never forget. It gives Frankie Carbone a death that sears itself into your memory. That's masterful filmmaking. I'll never argue otherwise. But here's what that choice erases. It erases Angelo Sepe's real story, the 14 arrests starting as a juvenile, the pet turtles in a killer's apartment, the 2-gram-a-day cocaine habit, the decade of reliable murder for Jimmy Burke, the decision to rob a connected dealer that sealed his fate, and Joanna Lombardo asleep in the next room who paid the price for a choice she had no part in making. And it erases Richard Eaton, the Notre Dame kid turned con artist who made himself indispensable to organized crime, who laundered Lufthansa money through Florida restaurants, who was arrogant enough to believe he could steal from Jimmy Burke and survive, whose frozen body in a truck gave the FBI the one piece of physical evidence they needed to put his own killer away for life. 2 men, 2 murders, each one individually more disturbing, more layered, and more revealing than the composite the movie built from their pieces. Both of them buried under 4 seconds of piano music and a throwaway line about thawing a body for the medical examiner. The Lufthansa aftermath consumed at least 9 lives directly. If you count Joanna Lombardo, a girl with no criminal history who died for the crime of being in the apartment, the number goes higher. Not $1 of the money stolen that December morning was ever recovered. Not a single piece of jewelry. Law enforcement chased the case for decades. In 2014, Vincent Asaro of the Bonanno family was arrested in connection with the robbery. He was 78 years old. He was acquitted. To this day, no one has ever been convicted specifically for the Lufthansa heist itself. The money's gone. The men who took it are either in the ground or in graves the government knows about but can't publicly acknowledge. And the most enduring image of it all, the frozen man swinging between the meat carcasses, belongs to a man whose name 99% of the people who've watched this film a dozen times couldn't tell you, Richard Eaton. That was his name. Angelo Sepe is buried in New York. His murder and Joanna Lombardo's murder beside him remain officially unsolved. The Lucchese family members believed to be responsible were never charged. In the calculus of organized crime, 2 silenced pistols in a basement on a summer morning in Brooklyn are simply the price you pay for taking what isn't yours. No trial, no charges. No headstone anybody visits. And that more than any frozen meat truck, more than any 4 seconds of Clapton on the soundtrack, is the real horror underneath the Frankie Carbone story, not the image Marty selected. The reality he couldn't fit on screen. A man who spent his entire adult life committing violence on behalf of an organization that executed him the instant he became inconvenient. A girl asleep in a bed who died because she was in the wrong room on the wrong night. And a con artist whose frozen body in a truck gave the FBI the evidence they needed to convict his own killer. 2 men, 2 murders, 1 4-second shot, and a robbery so perfectly executed that nearly half a century later, not a single dollar of it has ever been found.